The crisp envelope in the marshal's hand was more than paper. It was the beginning of the end for Brenda's smug empire. Governor Arthur Vance watched from afar, calm and certain, as the law itself prepared to knock on her door. This is the story of what happens when arrogance collides with power that cannot be swayed. Tap, like, subscribe for more stories of justice served, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. 3 months earlier, the only declaration of war on Arthur Vance's mountain was the one waged by chattering squirrels over a particularly promising pine cone. Arthur, governor by title but engineer by soul, sat on the wide-planked porch of the home his own hands had helped raise. The coffee in his mug was his one true vice, and the steam curling into the crisp morning air was a prayer of gratitude. He had bought this land, a massive untamed swath of timber and granite, 30 years ago, with the first real money he'd made from his civil engineering firm. It wasn't an investment in dollars and cents. It was an investment in sanity. It was the place he came to remember who he was, when the world of politics tried to make him forget. The wood of the porch railing was smooth and solid under his calloused palm, a testament to proper sanding and patient work. He believed in things that were built to last: bridges, dams, and a man's character. His late wife, Sarah, had called this his fortress of solitude, and for the first year after her passing, it had been exactly that. Now, in the 3rd year of his final term as governor, it was his refuge, the place he recharged before descending back into the valley to wrestle with budgets, bureaucracy, and the endless, grating demands of public life. He had no children, and the house, filled with the ghosts of laughter and love, was his legacy. He intended to leave the entire property to the state park system upon his death, a final gift to the people he served. But while he drew breath, it was his. The mountain was a living thing, and Arthur knew its rhythms better than his own heartbeat. He knew the way the wind whispered through the ponderosa pines just before a storm, the specific call of the red-tailed hawk that nested in the high crags, and the exact spot on the western ridge where the sunset bled into a painter's palette of orange and violet. His only regular companion up here was Silas, a man whose age was as indeterminate as the mountain itself. Silas had been the groundskeeper for the previous owner and had simply come with the land, a fixture as permanent as the granite outcroppings. He was wiry, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, and he spoke in short, cryptic sentences that always seemed to carry more weight than the words themselves. That morning, Silas was trimming the wild rose bushes that lined the gravel drive, his movements slow and deliberate. "Got a letter," Silas grunted, not looking up from his work. He gestured with his pruning shears toward the mailbox at the bottom of the long, winding driveway. "Official looking. Fancy envelope." Arthur nodded. It was probably another request for a donation or a formal invitation to some gala he had no intention of attending. The state forwarded his important mail, but the junk often found its way here. He took another sip of coffee, savoring the peace. The only sound was the rhythmic snip of Silas's shears and the distant cry of that hawk. He felt a profound sense of contentment, a deep, settled peace that came from being exactly where he was supposed to be. It was a peace he hadn't realized was so fragile, a silence he didn't know could be so easily shattered. Later that afternoon, after spending a few hours reviewing state water conservation reports, a governor's work was never truly done. Arthur took a walk down the driveway to retrieve the mail. The gravel crunched under his worn leather boots, a sound he found immensely satisfying. He pulled out a stack of catalogues, a bill, and the fancy envelope Silas had mentioned. It was cream-colored, thick, and addressed to the owner, Blackwood Mountain Estate. The return address was for a group he'd never heard of, the People's Coalition for Natural Access. He slit it open with his thumb, a frown creasing his brow. The letter inside was printed on the same expensive cardstock, the font a self-consciously elegant serif. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive prose, filled with phrases like community stewardship, hoarded natural resources, and moral obligation. It informed him, not asked, that his private property contained trails and vistas that were the rightful heritage of all people, and that his unethical hoarding of this land was a blight on the community. It concluded by strongly advising him to open his land for public use, starting with a designated trail from the main road to the summit. Arthur read it twice, a low, incredulous laugh bubbling in his chest. He had dealt with all manner of cranks and ideologues in his political career, but this was a new level of audacity. He pictured a group of trust fund hippies in a drum circle, complaining about the injustice of a man owning land he'd paid for with a lifetime of hard work. He tossed the letter onto the passenger seat of his pickup truck, intending to use it as kindling later. A week passed, and the letter was forgotten, lost in a flurry of state business and the simple, pleasant chores of maintaining his property. Arthur was up on a ladder, cleaning the gutters of his workshop, when he heard the first unfamiliar sound. It was a voice, amplified by a cheap bullhorn, echoing faintly up the mountainside. It was tinny, distorted, and utterly out of place in his sanctuary. He paused, his hand gripping a clump of wet leaves, and listened. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Shrill, hectoring, and self-righteous. He climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on his jeans, a knot of irritation tightening in his stomach. He walked to the edge of his porch, where a pair of high-powered binoculars rested on a tripod, a tool for birdwatching that was about to be repurposed. He focused them down the long driveway, toward the main gate and the county road beyond. And there she was, a single woman, standing on the public shoulder of the road, just outside his property line. She wore expensive-looking yoga pants, a bright pink windbreaker, and a look of profound indignation. She held a hand-painted sign that read, "This mountain belongs to the people." And every few seconds, she would raise a small, white bullhorn to her lips and spout some canned revolutionary slogan. Arthur watched her for a full 5 minutes, a strange mix of anger and amusement washing over him. It was absurd. It was pathetic, but it was also an invasion, a crack in the peaceful shell of his world. Arthur decided the best course of action was to ignore her. Engaging would only give her the attention she so clearly craved. He went back to his gutters, the rhythmic scrape of his tools a deliberate counterpoint to the woman's amplified squawking. But the sound grated on him, an incessant buzzing that made it impossible to fully relax. After an hour, he'd had enough. He got in his truck and drove down to the gate. He didn't open it, just parked on his side of the wrought iron bars and rolled down his window. The woman, seeing him approach, seemed to swell with importance. She strutted over, her sign held high. "Are you the owner of this hoarded land?" She demanded, her voice dripping with condescension. Arthur looked her over. She was in her late 40s, with a severe haircut and eyes that glittered with a zealot's fire. "I am," he said, his voice calm and even. "And you are on public property, which you have every right to be. But my property starts at this fence. I trust you'll respect that boundary." The woman sneered. "Boundaries are a tool of the oppressor. This land has a spirit, and it wants to be free. It doesn't want your fences." Arthur felt a headache beginning to form behind his eyes. It was like arguing with a pigeon. "Ma'am, the law is a bit more concerned with deeds and property taxes than the spirit of the land. Have a nice day." He started to roll up his window, but she slapped her hand on the glass. "You can't ignore us. We are the people, and we will be heard." That's when Arthur decided to make the first official move. He pulled out his phone and dialed the sheriff's department. The deputy who arrived was young, with a fresh face and a polite, weary demeanor that suggested he'd seen his share of local disputes. He spoke to the woman, Brenda, as she introduced herself. For a few minutes, his head cocked as he listened to her torrent of pseudo-legal, philosophical nonsense. Then he came over to Arthur's truck. "Governor," he said, touching the brim of his hat with a nod of respect. "She's not breaking any laws. As long as she stays on the shoulder and doesn't block your gate, she's within her rights to protest." Arthur had expected as much. He was the governor. He knew the law better than anyone. "I understand, Deputy. I just wanted to start a paper trail. This feels like the beginning of something, not the end." The deputy nodded, his expression grim. "I get that feeling too, sir. We'll keep an eye on things." He went back and said a few more words to Brenda, who watched him leave with a triumphant smirk. She had won the first round, and she knew it. She turned her attention back to Arthur, her voice on the bullhorn somehow louder and more grating than before. "The police can't protect you from the will of the people. Justice for the mountain." Arthur simply shook his head, rolled up his window, and drove back up to his house. The war had officially begun, and the first shot was a screech from a bullhorn. He knew then that ignoring her was no longer an option. This would require a more strategic approach. He was a builder, an engineer. He solved problems, and Brenda, he decided, was a problem he was going to solve, permanently. The next day, Brenda was back, and she had brought friends. 3 more cars were parked along the county road, and a small group of about 10 people now milled around the front gate. They had more signs, professionally printed this time. Nature isn't private property. Governor Vance. Tear down this fence. Ecological justice now. They had a folding table set up with a petition and a cooler of what looked like kombucha. Brenda was in her element, directing her small army with the imperious air of a frustrated film director. Arthur watched from the porch with his binoculars. He recognized the type. They were cause jumpers, bored suburbanites who mistook protesting for a personality. They weren't fighting for the mountain. They were fighting for a sense of purpose, a little drama to spice up their comfortable lives. The local news station, a small affiliate from the nearest town, had even sent a van. A reporter with overly coiffed hair was interviewing Brenda, who was putting on a masterful performance. She spoke with a pained, earnest expression about the cries of the land and the injustice of one man holding so much beauty hostage. She painted Arthur as a reclusive, greedy tycoon, a cartoon villain hoarding gold in his dragon's lair. Arthur felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in his gut. This wasn't about a trail anymore. This was a calculated attack on his character, broadcast for the entire county to see. He knew how this game was played. A lie, repeated often enough on television, becomes the truth for most people. That evening, the story led the local 6 o'clock news. The reporter presented it as a classic David versus Goliath story, a brave band of concerned citizens standing up to a powerful, wealthy politician. They showed clips of Brenda looking noble and righteous, then cut to a shot of Arthur's long, imposing driveway and the "Keep Out" private property sign on his gate, making it look as menacing as possible. They mentioned that they had reached out to the governor's office for comment but had not heard back. Of course, they hadn't. They'd called his public press office in the capital, which had no idea what was happening on his private land 100 miles away. It was a classic media ambush, designed to make him look guilty and evasive. Arthur sat in his leather armchair, the television casting a flickering glow on his face. He called Evelyn, his sharp, no-nonsense chief of staff. "Evelyn, have you seen the Channel 8 news tonight?" Her sigh was audible through the phone. "I have. Arthur, the comms team is already drafting a response. Standard stuff. The governor respects the right to peaceful protest, but the land is his private property, purchased legally, etc. Scrap it," Arthur said, his voice flat. "No comment. Not yet. I want to know who this woman is. Brenda. Last name unknown. I want to know everything. Where she lives, what she does, where she gets her money, and if she has a history of this sort of thing. Use our resources. If you have a money, when she have money, when she... I want a full workup on my desk by morning." There was a pause, and then Evelyn's voice, low and serious. "Consider it done, Governor. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Evelyn," Arthur replied, his eyes fixed on Brenda's smug face, now frozen on the screen. "I'm just getting started." The file Evelyn sent over the next morning was both illuminating and infuriating. Brenda's full name was Brenda Croft. She lived in a 40-square-foot house in a gated community called Willow Creek Estates, 150 miles away from his mountain. Her husband was a high-powered corporate attorney. Her activism was her career, funded by a series of shadowy non-profits, and her husband's deep pockets. The report detailed a pattern of behavior stretching back over a decade. She would pick a target, a small business, a local developer, a public official, and manufacture a controversy. She would organize protests, manipulate the local media, and make life a living hell for her chosen victim until they either gave in to her demands or were ruined. There was a list of her past causes. She'd protested a family-owned bakery for not offering enough vegan options, campaigned to have a historic statue removed because she found it problematic, and tried to shut down a new housing development because it would disrupt the migratory path of the monarch butterfly, a claim every biologist in the state had refuted. She wasn't an activist. She was a predator who fed on attention and outrage. The most telling detail, however, was a footnote about a failed campaign she'd run for city council in her own town 2 years prior. She'd been soundly defeated. Brenda Croft didn't want to save the world. She wanted to run it, and she punished anyone who stood in her way. This protest wasn't about Arthur's Mountain. It was about power. Armed with this new information, Arthur's strategy began to take shape. He was an engineer. He didn't solve problems by screaming at them. He solved them by analyzing their structure and finding their weakest point. Brenda's strength was the media, her ability to craft a public narrative. Her weakness was her hypocrisy. She lived in an exclusive, manicured paradise, a place with walls and rules far more stringent than his simple fence. Yet she railed against his right to privacy. The key was not to fight her on his turf, but on hers. For now, however, he had to manage the situation at his gate. The protests were growing in size and volume. They had brought drums now, and their chanting echoed through the valley from dawn till dusk. It was a constant, psychological assault. He called the sheriff again. "Sheriff Miller, it's Arthur Vance." The sheriff's voice was heavy with fatigue. "Governor, I know. I've got 2 deputies stationed down there full-time now. They're doing their best to keep things civil, but this Brenda Croft character knows the law. She knows exactly how far she can push without breaking it. I'm more concerned about what happens when she decides to step over that line," Arthur said. "It's escalating. I can feel it. Keep a detailed log of everything. Every car, every person, every incident. I want a record." "We're on it, sir," the sheriff assured him. "But frankly, I wish they'd just give us a reason to haul them all in." "Patience, Sheriff," Arthur said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I have a feeling they will." The escalation came sooner than Arthur expected. A few days later, he was reviewing geological surveys for a state dam project when Silas burst into his study. His usual stoicism shattered. "Governor, you need to see this." Silas's face was pale. Arthur followed him out to the porch. The noise from the gate was different now. The chanting was gone, replaced by angry shouting and the sound of something metallic rattling. Arthur raised his binoculars. The protesters were no longer just standing on the shoulder. A group of them was physically shaking his front gate, a heavy, custom-wrought iron structure anchored in concrete. They were hanging signs on it with zip ties, defacing his property. Brenda was at the forefront, bullhorn in hand, screaming encouragement. "Tear it down, this illegal wall of greed!" The 2 deputies were trying to push them back, creating a thin line between the mob and the gate, but they were outnumbered 20-1. Arthur's blood ran cold with fury. This was no longer a protest, it was a siege. He watched as one of the protesters, a young man with a vacant expression, spat on the deputy's car. That was it. He grabbed his phone and dialed Sheriff Miller directly. "Sheriff, they're attempting to damage my property and are actively engaging with your deputies. This is no longer a peaceful assembly. I want them removed." He could hear the steel in his own voice. The time for patience was over. Sheriff Miller didn't hesitate. "Understood, Governor. Reinforcements are on the way." Within 10 minutes, 3 more patrol cars, sirens screaming, tore down the county road and screeched to a halt near the gate. The sight of the additional officers, who emerged from their vehicles with a grim sense of purpose, was enough to give the protesters pause. The gate shaking stopped. The mob took a few hesitant steps back. Sheriff Miller himself got out of the lead car. He was a big man, with a presence that commanded respect. He strode over to Brenda, his face an unreadable mask. "Brenda Croft," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Your protest is no longer peaceful. You and your people will disperse immediately. You will take your signs, your tables, and your cars, and you will leave this area." Brenda, for the first time, seemed to lose a bit of her composure. She sputtered, "We have a right to be here. This is a public road. You can't intimidate us." The sheriff didn't raise his voice. "I am not intimidating you, ma'am. I am giving you a lawful order. You have moved from protesting to active harassment and attempted property damage. If you do not disperse in the next 2 minutes, I will begin making arrests for unlawful assembly and interfering with a police officer." He pointed to the zip-tied signs on the gate. "And we'll add vandalism to the list for whoever put those up." The threat hung in the air, heavy and final. The resolve of her followers began to crumble. This wasn't fun anymore. Brenda looked at the faces of her followers, then at the stern, unyielding faces of the deputies. The fire in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of calculation. Getting arrested might be good for the cause, a badge of honor to be flashed in front of the cameras. But it would also be messy, inconvenient, and expensive. Her husband, the corporate lawyer, hated dealing with her petty criminal charges. She made a decision. She raised her bullhorn. "All right, everyone, we've made our point for today. The corrupt forces of the state are trying to silence us, but we will not be silenced. We will be back, stronger than ever." It was a pathetic attempt to spin a retreat into a victory, and everyone there knew it. Her group began to grumble and pack up their things, a disorganized and sullen retreat. They cut the signs off the gate, stuffed their petitions into tote bags, and folded their table. As Brenda was getting into her luxury SUV, she locked eyes with the security camera she knew was mounted on the gatepost, the camera that fed directly to Arthur's study. She gave it a venomous glare, a silent promise that this was far from over. Arthur watched her drive away, feeling not a sense of victory, but a grim certainty. She would be back, and next time, she would be more reckless. He needed a permanent solution. He needed to find a weapon that she couldn't fight, a force more powerful and more absolute than her mob and her media allies. That night, Arthur sat by his fireplace, a glass of bourbon in his hand, the state budget reports lying unread on the table beside him. The house was quiet again, but it was a tense, expectant silence. He wasn't an aggressive man by nature. As an engineer, he believed in precision, in applying the right amount of force in the right place to achieve a stable, lasting result. As a governor, he believed in the rule of law. What Brenda was doing was a perversion of both. She was using the tools of a free society, free speech, the right to assemble as a cudgel to bully and intimidate. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the firelight dance within it. His mind, trained to see systems and structures, began to analyze the problem on a grander scale. He couldn't fight her with protests or media statements. That was her game, and she had mastered it. He couldn't rely on the local police to be a permanent solution. That was a drain on public resources and an unfair burden on Sheriff Miller and his men. He needed something else, something systemic, something bureaucratic, something that operated on a level she couldn't even comprehend, let alone fight. The state. He was the head of the executive branch of the state government. He commanded a vast and powerful machine, a labyrinth of departments and agencies, of rules and regulations. Brenda was using the people as her shield. It was time, he thought, to remind her what the state, acting on behalf of all the people, was truly capable of. The idea came to him not in a flash of inspiration, but in a slow, dawning realization during a routine infrastructure briefing the following week. He was on a conference call with Evelyn and the head of the Department of Transportation, a man named George Peterson. They were discussing the Route 7 expansion project, a massive, decade-long plan to build a new highway connecting the state's main industrial hub with the eastern seaboard. It was a vital project for the state's economy, but it was bogged down in planning and zoning disputes. "The main sticking point is the Millersburg corridor," George was saying, his voice tinny over the speakerphone. "The original proposed route goes through a protected wetland, and the environmental impact studies are a nightmare. The alternate route cuts through a historic district, and the preservation societies are up in arms. We're stuck between a swamp and a hard place, Governor." Arthur was only half listening, his mind still on the situation at his gate. Brenda had returned, as promised, though her crowd was smaller and more subdued. They were careful to stay off his property, but their presence was a constant, low-grade infection. Then, something George said cut through his distraction. "We've run a dozen alternative surveys. There's one other possibility, Route 7C. But the land acquisition costs would be astronomical. It goes right through the heart of Willow Creek Estates. The property values there are through the roof. A profound stillness settled over Arthur. Willow Creek Estates, Brenda Croft's neighborhood. He sat up straight in his chair. "George," he said, his voice quiet and focused, "send me everything you have on Route 7C. The surveys, the traffic analyses, the cost projections, everything." The data package arrived on his encrypted server an hour later. Arthur spent the rest of the day and most of the night poring over it, his engineer's brain firing on all cylinders. He spread the survey maps out on his massive oak desk, the same desk where he signed bills into law. Route 7C had been dismissed early in the process as being too expensive and politically difficult. Willow Creek Estates was home to some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the state. The idea of plowing a 6-lane highway through their manicured paradise was considered political suicide. But Arthur looked at the data not as a politician, but as a problem solver. The original route through the wetlands was an environmental disaster waiting to happen, a potential Superfund site in the making. The historic district route would destroy a part of the state's heritage. Route 7C, however, presented a clean, elegant solution from a purely logistical standpoint. It was the most direct path. The terrain was stable. It avoided all the environmental and historical pitfalls. The only obstacle was money and political will. Arthur traced the proposed path with his finger. It cut a clean line through the northern section of the gated community. He cross-referenced the survey map with a county property database, and there it was, Lot 114. A large corner property with a pool and an immaculate garden. Registered owner, Brenda Croft. The highway didn't just go through her neighborhood. It went directly through her house. A slow, cold smile spread across Arthur's face. It was perfect. The next morning, he called an in-person secure meeting with Evelyn and George Peterson. He laid out the maps on the conference table in his private office in the capital. "We're going with 7C, he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. George paled. "Governor, with all due respect, the political fallout will be immense. The residents of Willow Creek are major donors. They have lawyers on retainer who specialize in this kind of thing. It will be a legal quagmire for years." Arthur looked him in the eye. "And the environmental lawsuits from the wetlands route won't be? Or the public outcry from demolishing a historic neighborhood? George, every option on the table is a fight. I'm just choosing the fight we can win. The one that is ultimately best for the long-term infrastructure of this state." He turned to Evelyn. "I want you to quietly start building the case. I want a new series of reports. I want you to emphasize the environmental benefits of 7C over the wetlands. I want a revised economic impact study showing how this more direct route will save the state billions in commercial shipping costs over the next 50 years. I want a historical preservation report on the value of the district we'd be saving. I want this route to be so obviously the correct choice that anyone who argues against it looks like they're putting their own selfish interests above the public good." Evelyn's eyes lit up with a spark of understanding. She saw what he was doing. It was a brilliant, ruthless political maneuver, wrapped in the unimpeachable logic of good governance. "Consider it done, Arthur," she said. "We'll build a case so ironclad the Supreme Court couldn't punch a hole in it." For the next month, Arthur played 2 games at once. On the mountain, he was the stoic victim, enduring the daily harassment from Brenda's dwindling but still noisy group of protesters. He had security cameras document every transgression, a protester throwing a half-eaten sandwich over the fence, another letting their dog relieve itself on his prize-winning rose bushes near the gate, Brenda herself delivering a vicious, slanderous monologue to a local blogger's live stream. He and Sheriff Miller continued to build their meticulous file of harassment. The police were called almost daily, and each time they would arrive, issue warnings, and log the incident. The protesters were becoming more brazen, their actions devolving from political speech to petty vandalism. Meanwhile, in the capital, Governor Vance was the master strategist, moving the pieces of his plan into place with surgical precision. Evelyn and her team worked in secret, commissioning the new studies, running the numbers, and preparing the legal groundwork. They built a fortress of data and expert testimony around Route 7C. The project was presented in committees not as a radical new idea, but as a re-evaluation based on new environmental and economic data. The name Willow Creek Estates was never mentioned in the early stages. It was only referred to by its survey designation. It was death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. A quiet, inexorable process that moved forward completely unseen by its ultimate target. Brenda Croft was so focused on her small, symbolic war at his gate that she had no idea that a real army, an army of surveyors and lawyers and state officials, was preparing to march straight through her front door. The irony was a thing of beauty. Brenda, standing on the side of a public road, screaming about how Arthur's private land should be seized for the public good, was completely oblivious to the fact that the state, the very entity she claimed to champion, was preparing to seize her private land for the actual, demonstrable, public good. Arthur would sometimes watch her on the security feed, her face contorted in a mask of righteous fury, and feel a sense of almost cosmic justice. She was a caricature of a revolutionary, a wealthy woman playing dress-up with the language of the oppressed. She had no idea what real power looked like. She thought power was a bullhorn and a crowd of angry followers. Arthur knew that real power was quiet. Real power was a line on a map, a clause in a statute, a signature on an official order. It was the slow, grinding, and unstoppable machinery of the state, and he was the one with his hand on the lever. He instructed Evelyn to make sure that every step of the process was followed to the letter of the law. There could be no shortcuts, no hint of impropriety. The land surveys had to be precise, the public notices posted correctly, and the offers of fair market value calculated generously. He would defeat her not by breaking the rules, but by using the rules with a level of mastery she couldn't possibly match. He would use her own weapon, the concept of the greater good, against her, but he would wield it with the full weight and authority of the state she so cavalierly invoked. The final piece of the puzzle was the public announcement. It had to be handled perfectly to frame the narrative from the outset. Evelyn arranged a major press conference at the Department of Transportation headquarters. It wasn't billed as being about the Route 7 expansion specifically, but as a general, major infrastructure initiative update. Arthur stood at the podium, flanked by George Peterson and a host of engineers and environmental scientists. He spoke for 20 minutes about the state's commitment to economic growth and responsible environmental stewardship. He detailed the challenges with the original Route 7 proposals, presenting the wetlands and the historic district as two unacceptable options. Then, with a click of a button, the giant screen behind him changed to a detailed map of Route 7C. After extensive re-evaluation, Arthur announced, his voice ringing with gubernatorial authority, "My administration has determined that the revised 7C corridor is the only path forward that both protects our precious natural resources and preserves our state's history. It is the most fiscally responsible and logistically sound choice. It is, simply put, the right choice for the future of this state." The reporters in the room started murmuring, their eyes tracing the red line on the map, realizing for the first time exactly where it went. The first question was from a sharp-eyed reporter from the state's largest newspaper. "Governor, that route appears to go directly through Willow Creek Estates. Isn't that one of the wealthiest communities in the state? Are you prepared for the political and legal battle that will ensue?" Arthur gave a calm, measured smile. "Progress always has a cost. But this administration will not ask our wetlands or our history to pay that price. The state will, of course, provide generous and fair market value for all acquired properties, as required by law. This project is for the benefit of all citizens, and we are confident that the residents of the affected area will understand their civic duty to contribute to the greater good." The news hit the state like a bombshell. The press conference was the lead story on every news channel, the front page of every newspaper. The narrative was exactly as Arthur and Evelyn had planned it. He was the bold, decisive leader, making a tough but necessary choice for the good of the state. He was the environmental champion, the protector of history, the fiscally responsible steward of taxpayer money. The residents of Willow Creek Estates were, predictably, apoplectic. They immediately hired a high-powered legal team and a PR firm. Their spokesman, a slick lawyer, appeared on television that night, decrying the governor's plan as a gross abuse of power and an assault on private property rights. Arthur watched the broadcast from his study on the mountain, a deep sense of satisfaction settling over him. The lawyer's arguments were hollow, and he knew it. By so thoroughly documenting the superiority of Route 7C, Arthur had preemptively neutered their primary legal challenges. They could argue about the price, but they couldn't argue that the decision was arbitrary or capricious. He had made it a simple choice for the courts and the public. A swamp, a historic town, or a few rich people's houses. He had framed the debate perfectly. And throughout all the news coverage, all the interviews with angry homeowners and frantic lawyers, one person was conspicuously silent. Brenda Croft, the professional protester, the loudest voice in any room, was nowhere to be found. It took 2 full days for Brenda to realize what had happened. She was so consumed with her personal crusade against Arthur that she hadn't even been paying attention to state infrastructure news. According to a source Evelyn had in the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, the realization came during an emergency community meeting held in their lavish clubhouse. As the lawyers explained the grim reality of the state's power of eminent domain, Brenda sat in stunned silence. She, the champion of seizing private land for the public, was now on the receiving end. The hypocrisy was so staggering, so absolute, that it left her speechless. Her neighbors, who had previously tolerated her activism as a harmless eccentricity, now turned on her with a vengeance. They screamed at her, accusing her of bringing this curse down upon them. "You and your stupid protests," one man yelled, his face purple with rage. "You poked the bear, Brenda. You picked a fight with the one man who could do this to us, and now we're all going to pay the price." The professional agitator was, for the first time in her life, the target of a genuinely angry mob, and she had no idea what to do. She had spent years dishing it out, but she had no clue how to take it. She fled the meeting in tears, her carefully constructed world of self-righteousness crumbling around her. The protests at Arthur's gate stopped immediately. The few remaining followers she had vanished overnight, unwilling to be associated with the woman who had brought a 6-lane highway crashing down on their wealthy enclave. The silence that returned to the mountain was deeper and more profound than before. Arthur stood on his porch, sipping his morning coffee, and listened. There was no bullhorn, no chanting, no drums, just the wind in the pines and the cry of the hawk. It was over. At least, that part of it was. Silas came by, a rare wide grin splitting his wrinkled face. "Looks like you fixed the pest problem, Governor," he said, tipping his hat. "Sometimes," Arthur replied, looking out over his peaceful valley. "You just need to use a bigger hammer." But it wasn't a hammer he had used, it was a scalpel. He had diagnosed the disease and surgically removed it, using the system itself as his instrument. It was a clean, elegant, and deeply satisfying solution. Now, all that was left was to watch the final act play out. The legal challenges would come, of course. The fight wasn't over, but the decisive battle had been won. He had taken Brenda's narrative and turned it against her, recasting her from a heroic activist into a selfish hypocrite who only cared about the public good when it was someone else's property on the line. The legal battle was, as George had predicted, a quagmire. But it was a quagmire for Brenda and her neighbors, not for the state. Arthur had given Evelyn a blank check to hire the best eminent domain lawyers in the country to represent the Department of Transportation. The state's case was, as promised, ironclad. The mountain of evidence supporting Route 7C was overwhelming. Report after report, expert after expert, all testified to its superiority. The Willow Creek legal team tried everything. They argued procedural errors. They argued insufficient environmental review. They argued that the state's valuation of their properties was too low. They lost on every single count. The courts, faced with the state's meticulous preparation, sided with the DOT at every turn. The public, meanwhile, had no sympathy for the residents of Willow Creek. Letters to the editor poured in, praising Governor Vance for his courage and his commitment to progress. Cartoonists drew pictures of wealthy people in tennis outfits trying to fend off a bulldozer with a polo mallet. Brenda Croft became a local punchline. She tried to go on the news to rebrand herself as a victim of a vindictive politician. But no one was buying it. The reporter from Channel 8, the same one who had so eagerly promoted her cause months ago, now asked her tough, pointed questions. "Mrs. Croft, he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. You were a vocal proponent of seizing the governor's land for public use. Why is it different when it's your land? Her sputtering, incoherent answer was a joy for Arthur to behold. The final court appeal was denied 6 weeks after the initial announcement. The legal road was clear. The Department of Transportation could now proceed with the final step, issuing the official notices of seizure and making its formal offers of compensation. Evelyn called Arthur to give him the news. The last injunction was just lifted by the state Supreme Court, she said, a note of triumph in her voice. It's done. We can send out the notices tomorrow. Good, Arthur said. Evelyn, there's one last thing. I want to make sure that the notice for Lot 114, the Croft property, is served in person by a state marshal, and I want a DOT photographer to accompany him to document the moment for the official record. Evelyn was silent for a moment, then a low chuckle. I understand, Governor. Consider it arranged. Is there a particular time of day you'd prefer? Morning, Arthur replied. I want the sun to be shining. He wanted the moment to be captured in bright, unflinching clarity. He wanted a permanent record of the consequences of her actions. He wasn't just taking her house, he was taking her narrative, her legacy, and reducing it to a single, humiliating photograph of a government official on her doorstep, holding the bill for her arrogance. It was a cold, calculated, and deeply personal final move in a game she had started. But he had finished. And so it was that Arthur found himself in his study, watching the live feed from a tiny camera on the marshal's uniform. He was witnessing the end of the story, the moment his plan came to its perfect, logical conclusion. He watched the marshal's steady march up the cobblestone path. He saw Brenda's face through the window, the dawning horror in her eyes as she realized who he was and what he was holding. The marshal rang the doorbell. A long moment passed. Arthur could hear the faint sound of birds chirping on the audio feed. Finally, the door opened a crack. Yes? Brenda's voice was a thin, reedy thing, stripped of all its usual bluster. Brenda Croft? The marshal asked, his voice a deep, impersonal baritone. I am a marshal for the state of... and I have an official notice of seizure to serve you from the Department of Transportation. He held out the envelope. Brenda stared at it, as if it were a venomous snake. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took it. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew what it was. It was the checkmate. The marshal tipped his hat. You'll be contacted by the department regarding the timeline for vacating the property. Have a good day, ma'am. He turned and walked away, his job done. The door closed, and the feed cut out. Arthur leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. Justice. It wasn't always loud and dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, bureaucratic, and delivered in a crisp, cream-colored envelope. 1-0. The aftermath was a study in contrasts. On the mountain, life returned to a state of profound peace. The ugly, hand-painted signs were gone. The gravel on the shoulder of the road was no longer packed down by the cars of protesters, and the air was clean, free of the tinny screech of a bullhorn. Arthur resumed his quiet routine, his morning coffee on the porch feeling more like a victory celebration than a simple ritual. He walked his land, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth, feeling a renewed sense of ownership and belonging. He had defended his sanctuary, not with fences and guards, but with intelligence and a deep understanding of the system. He had protected his peace by waging a war of paper and ink, a war his opponent never even knew she was fighting until it was too late. He had proven that the principles he applied to engineering, patience, precision, and an understanding of structural integrity could also be applied to dismantling a human problem. Silas, ever the pragmatist, summed it up best as he helped Arthur repair a section of fence the protesters had damaged. Some folks, he said, pulling a length of wire taut, they just got to learn that when you kick a hornet's nest, you're liable to get stung. You just happen to be the fella who owned the whole darn nest. In Willow Creek Estates, however, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. The community was fractured, torn apart by recriminations and lawsuits. Neighbors who had once shared glasses of wine at poolside barbecues were now suing each other over property valuations and relocation costs. The for sale signs started popping up, not just on the properties slated for demolition, but throughout the neighborhood, as residents decided to get out before the construction and the noise began. Brenda Croft was a pariah. She was uninvited from the book club, blacklisted from the neighborhood social committee, and openly shunned at the local organic market. Her husband, facing social and professional ruin, filed for divorce, citing the public humiliation and financial strain her activism had caused. She was left alone in her beige castle, surrounded by hostile neighbors, with the roar of approaching bulldozers sounding closer every day. She had tried to make Arthur a villain in a story of her own making, but had ended up the villain in everyone else's. Her quest for a public platform had left her with nothing but private misery. The police, who had spent weeks dealing with her antics at Arthur's gate, now had to patrol her own neighborhood to keep the peace between the feuding residents. The irony was almost too much to bear. The state, for its part, moved with ruthless efficiency. The offers they made for the properties were, as Arthur had insisted, fair and even slightly generous, which undercut the residents' legal ability to delay the process further. Most homeowners, seeing the writing on the wall, took the money and cut their losses. A few, like Brenda, tried to hold out, filing nuisance lawsuits and refusing to cooperate. But the state had the law on its side. The eviction notices were issued, and one by one, the holdouts were forced to leave. The day the demolition crews arrived in Willow Creek was a media event. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the surreal images of massive yellow excavators tearing into million-dollar homes. The first house they targeted was not Brenda's. It was one 3 doors down. Arthur had given specific instructions for that. He wanted her to watch. He wanted her to sit in her house, the foundation vibrating with the force of her neighbor's home being reduced to rubble, and contemplate every decision that had led her to that moment. He wanted her to understand the finality of her defeat, the sheer unstoppable power she had so foolishly provoked. The police were there, of course, not to protect her, but to ensure the demolition crews could do their work unimpeded by any last-ditch desperate attempts at protest from the remaining homeowners. Brenda's house was one of the last to go. By then, her street was a wasteland of scraped earth and broken concrete, a brown scar across what had once been a perfect green lawn. The news cameras were there for her eviction. She was escorted out by 2 sheriff's deputies, the same department she had tormented for weeks. She carried a single box of personal items, her face a pale, defeated mask. She didn't say a word. All the fight, all the self-righteous fury, was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed emptiness. She looked not at the cameras, but at the ruins of her life, the tangible proof of her colossal miscalculation. As she was led to a waiting car, a reporter shouted a final question. Was it worth it, Brenda? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The wreckage of her neighborhood, soon to be a bustling highway serving millions of people, was answer enough. She had wanted to make a statement, and she had. The statement was that a person's life could be unmade by the very system they sought to manipulate. Arthur watched the clip on the evening news, feeling not elation, but a quiet, somber sense of closure. The problem had been analyzed, the solution had been implemented, and the project was complete. It was time to move on. The construction of the Governor Arthur Vance Memorial Highway, a name the state legislature insisted upon over his modest objections, took 2 years. It was an engineering marvel, a testament to what could be accomplished when politics and logistics were perfectly aligned. It cut travel times, eased congestion, and sparked an economic boom in the eastern part of the state. It was, by every conceivable measure, a resounding success and a cornerstone of his legacy. The new road was celebrated as a victory for the people, a triumph of public good over private interests. The story of its controversial routing through Willow Creek became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of provoking the wrong person. Arthur, for his part, rarely visited the highway. He saw it on maps and in economic reports, and that was enough for him. His victory wasn't in the ribbon-cutting ceremony or the laudatory newspaper editorials. His victory was in the silence he had reclaimed, the peace he had restored to his mountain sanctuary. He had used the power of his office not for personal enrichment or aggrandizement, but to defend his most fundamental right, the right to be left alone. It was a vindictive act, perhaps, but it was also a righteous one. He had responded to an attack not by lowering himself to his attacker's level, but by raising the conflict to a level where she could no longer compete. In the years that followed, Arthur finished his final term as governor and retired permanently to his mountain home. He lived a quiet life, tending to his garden, maintaining the house, and enjoying the simple, rhythmic pleasures of the seasons. He fulfilled his promise, and upon his death at the ripe old age of 87, the entire Blackwood Mountain estate was deeded to the state, becoming the centerpiece of the new Sarah Vance Memorial Park, named for his beloved wife. The trails were open to the public, and thousands of people every year came to enjoy the vistas and the wilderness that he had so fiercely protected. The main trail to the summit was named the Governor's Path, and at the trailhead, a small bronze plaque was installed. It didn't mention the highway or the protests. It simply contained a quote Arthur had once given in an interview. "True strength is not about making the most noise. It's about building things that last." It was a fitting epitaph for an engineer, a governor, and a man who understood the profound difference between shouting at the world and quietly, deliberately, reshaping it to your will. He had taken a problem defined by chaos and noise and had imposed upon it a solution of order, logic, and devastatingly effective silence. The story of Brenda Croft became a footnote, a forgotten casualty in the march of progress. After losing her home and her husband, she disappeared from public life. The last anyone heard, she had moved to a small, rented apartment in a different state, living in the kind of anonymous, powerless obscurity she had always feared. Her name, once a clarion call for a certain brand of performative outrage, was now only ever invoked as a joke, a shorthand for hypocrisy. She had sought a legacy and had found only infamy. Her activist groups disbanded, their funding dried up, and the causes she championed were picked up by others or faded away. She had built her entire identity on a foundation of public grievance, and when the public turned against her, that identity collapsed into dust, leaving nothing behind. The police records from her protests at Arthur's Gate gathered dust in a filing cabinet in the sheriff's office, a thick file detailing a pointless, self-destructive war that had ended in her complete and utter annihilation. Her attempt to take a small piece of Arthur's world had cost her all of her own. It was a lesson in proportionality, a lesson she had learned far, far too late. The system she thought she could game had gamed her, and the house always wins. Arthur often reflected on the series of events, not with pride in his vindictiveness, but with a sober acknowledgement of the necessities of power. He hadn't wanted to destroy Brenda Croft's life. He had wanted to end her harassment. The destruction of her life was an incidental, albeit necessary, consequence of the most efficient solution. He had a duty to the state, and the highway was a genuine benefit to millions. Brenda's house was simply a small, tactical sacrifice for a much larger strategic gain. It was the cold, hard calculus of governance, a world away from the emotional, chaotic realm of protests and public sentiment she inhabited. She had brought a knife to a gunfight, and he had brought a topographical survey map and the state's legal code. There was never any doubt about who would win. The police who had been forced to deal with her had a new respect for the governor. They saw a man who didn't just complain about a problem, but who used the full, legitimate scope of his authority to eradicate it. Sheriff Miller once ran into Arthur in town years later, long after both were retired. "Governor," he'd said, shaking his hand warmly, "I still tell the new recruits the story of the Route 7 expansion. I tell them it's a lesson in what happens when a loudmouth with a sign picks a fight with a quiet man with a plan." The professional ally, Evelyn, rose through the ranks of state government, her reputation as a ruthlessly efficient and loyal operator, cemented by her work on the highway project. She became a legend in the capital. The iron hand inside the governor's velvet glove, she had seen Arthur's initial, simmering anger and had helped him channel it into a focused, unstoppable legal and bureaucratic assault. She understood that modern warfare was often fought not on battlefields, but in committee rooms and court dockets. She was the architect of the paper fortress that had protected the project and doomed Brenda's cause. Her role was never public, but those in the know understood that she was as instrumental in Brenda's downfall as Arthur himself. She had been the one to find the legal precedents, to hire the right experts, and to manage the delicate political maneuvering required to push the project through. She was a testament to the fact that behind every great leader is an even greater chief of staff, someone who knows how to translate a vision, however vengeful, into a flawless, executed reality. Her loyalty to Arthur was absolute, born of a shared belief in order, competence, and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The rallied community, in this story, wasn't the one Brenda had tried to manufacture at Arthur's gate. It was the entire population of the state's eastern counties. They were the ones who truly benefited from her defeat. The new highway brought jobs, lowered the cost of goods, and made their communities more accessible. They became Arthur's most ardent supporters, the bedrock of his political legacy. They saw him not as a vindictive politician, but as a visionary leader who was willing to crack a few eggs, or in this case, a few mansions to make an omelette for the entire state. They were the silent majority whose lives were tangibly improved by the project. Their support drowned out the noise from the wealthy residents of Willow Creek and the tut-tutting of media pundits who wrung their hands about the governor's hardball tactics. They were the real people whose will was being done, and their prosperity was the ultimate justification for the means Arthur had employed. The highway wasn't just a strip of asphalt. It was a symbol of a government that worked for the many, not the privileged few. This, Arthur knew, was the most delicious irony of all. Brenda's phony People's Crusade had inadvertently sparked a genuine populist victory, just not the one she had envisioned. One aspect that Arthur found particularly gratifying was the reaction of Brenda's own neighbors in the aftermath. Once the initial shock and anger at their shared fate wore off, their fury focused squarely on her. They saw her not as a fellow victim, but as the catalyst for their misfortune. The legal fund they had established was quickly drained, and as the state's case proved insurmountable, they began to accept the buyouts. But they ostracized Brenda completely. She was the typhoid Mary of their community, the one who had brought the plague upon their houses. They shared stories of her past tyrannies as the de facto head of their homeowners association, her petty enforcement of trivial rules, and her condescending attitude. It turned out that many of them were secretly glad to be free of her, even if it cost them their homes. This spontaneous, organic shunning was a more potent punishment than anything the state could inflict. Arthur had taken her house, but her own community had taken her social standing, her last remaining source of power and validation. She was left with nothing. A queen deposed not just by a rival monarch, but by her own resentful subjects. The police, when called to the neighborhood for disputes, often reported back to the sheriff that the common refrain from residents was, "This all started with Brenda Croft." The wise elder, Silas, provided the moral anchor for Arthur throughout the ordeal. Early on, before the protests had even begun, Silas had warned him. "Seen it before, Governor," he'd said, leaning on a shovel. "Folks come up from the city, they ain't got no real problems, so they invent 'em. They see a man with a nice, quiet piece of land, and they think he stole it from him somehow. They think silence is a crime." His words had been a prophecy, and as the situation escalated, Silas was a source of quiet, unwavering support. He never offered strategic advice, but his presence was a constant reminder of what Arthur was fighting for: the land, the peace, the legacy. When the news of the highway project broke, Silas just nodded slowly, a knowing look in his ancient eyes. He didn't need to ask questions. He understood the brutal, elegant symmetry of it. "Silas, an eye for an eye," Silas had muttered one afternoon as they watched the news report on the demolition, "except her eye was a glass one, and yours is a whole mountain." He understood the concept of proportional response. Brenda had thrown a rock at a fortress, and Arthur had responded by rerouting a river to wash her house away. It was, in Silas's simple, earthy philosophy, the natural order of things. The humor in the situation was dark and deeply ironic. Arthur never laughed out loud at Brenda's misfortune, but he allowed himself a few grim, internal chuckles. The sheer absurdity of her downfall was a source of quiet amusement. The woman who screamed about public access, being denied access to her own front door. The activist who railed against walls of greed, finding her own home, declared an obstruction to progress. The self-proclaimed voice of the people is being condemned by the actual, legal will of the people. Her every action, every word, had been a boomerang she had thrown with all her might, only to be stunned when it came back and knocked her unconscious. Her downfall was entirely self-inflicted, a masterpiece of unintentional self-sabotage. The police reports themselves contained moments of black humor, with deputies dutifully recording Brenda's increasingly unhinged rants about cosmic injustice and political persecution, all while standing on the shoulder of a road she was no longer legally allowed to use to get to a house she no longer legally owned. The universe, Arthur mused, had a strange and terrible sense of humor, and Brenda Croft had just become its favorite punchline. The narrative arc was a classic David versus Goliath story, but with a twist. At first, Brenda and the media had cast Arthur as the Goliath, the powerful, untouchable governor in his mountain fortress. Brenda was the plucky David with her slingshot of public opinion. But as the story unfolded, the roles reversed. Brenda was revealed to be the true bully, the tyrant of her own small fiefdom, using the language of the underdog as a disguise. Arthur, the quiet man who just wanted to be left alone, became the reluctant David, forced to fight back. But his slingshot wasn't a rock. It was the entire apparatus of the state. He didn't just slay Goliath. He used Goliath's own sword to do it, then dismantled Goliath's house brick by brick, and used the materials to build a bridge for everyone else. It became an inspirational story. Not about the little guy winning, but about a big guy using his power justly and precisely to put down a smaller, but more noxious, threat. It was a lesson that the scale of power is less important than the wisdom and will with which it is applied. He had proven that the biggest dog in the fight doesn't have to bark the loudest. The suspense in the story was not in whether Arthur would win, but in how. Once he decided to act, the outcome was never in doubt. The tension came from the slow, meticulous assembly of his weapon. The audience, privy to his internal monologue, could see the pieces coming together. The infrastructure meeting, the map on his desk, the secret work of Evelyn's team. They could watch Brenda, oblivious and arrogant, continuing her pointless protests at the gate, while the guillotine was being quietly constructed over her own house. It was a slow-burn thriller, a bureaucratic procedural. The climax wasn't a shouted confrontation, but the quiet, official act of a court ruling, a press conference, a notice being served. The police's role shifted from being hapless referees in a one-sided shouting match to being the solemn, official instruments of the state's final judgment. When they escorted Brenda from her home, it was the final, quiet checkmate in a game she never even knew she was playing. The suspense was in the how done it, not the who done it, and the how was a masterclass in the weaponization of bureaucracy. Arthur's internal monologue was that of a blue-collar philosopher. His thoughts were grounded in the practical, tangible world of his engineering background. He saw Brenda's arguments not as ideological challenges, but as structural flaws. Her logic was unsound, her foundation was cracked, and her entire enterprise was doomed to collapse under its own hypocrisy. She's building a tower on sand, he thought to himself one night, and she's angry that the tide is coming in. He used simple, powerful metaphors to understand the conflict. It was a chess match, a siege, a construction project. His goal was not just to win, but to build a solution that was permanent and stable. He wasn't interested in a temporary victory. He wanted to solve the problem for good. This practical, street-smart approach to a complex political and social conflict was his greatest asset. He didn't get lost in the weeds of ideology. He just focused on the most efficient way to get from point A harassment to point B, peace. And if a 6-lane highway was the straightest line between those 2 points, then so be it. The sentence style of the narrative reflects this duality. The descriptions of the mountain are long, flowing, and filled with sensory details. The scent of the air, the feel of the wood, the sound of the wind. This is Arthur's world, the place of peace and order that he values. In contrast, the sentences describing the conflict and his response are often short, punchy, and declarative. Brenda had made a mistake. He would correct it. The plan was simple. The execution would be perfect. This hybrid style creates a rhythm that mirrors the pacing of the story itself. The calm, measured pace of his life, interrupted by the sharp, jarring staccato of the conflict, followed by the deliberate, methodical rhythm of his response, the frequent rhetorical questions in his internal thoughts. Did she really think this would work? What was her endgame? Serve to engage the reader directly, inviting them into his process of analysis and problem-solving, making them a partner in his methodical quest for justice and a satisfying resolution. The sensory details are crucial. The story contrasts the organic, natural world of Arthur's mountain with the artificial, sterile world of Brenda's suburbia. On the mountain, there is the smell of coffee and pine, the crunch of gravel, the solid feel of wood and stone. In Willow Creek, as described in the news reports and property files Arthur reviews, it's the chemical smell of over-fertilized lawns, the monotonous beige of the houses, the unnatural silence of a gated community. The visual of the massive yellow excavator tearing into one of these beige boxes is a powerful, cinematic moment, the raw, chaotic force of reality intruding upon a carefully constructed fantasy. The sound of the bullhorn is an auditory assault, a violation of the natural soundscape. The final, profound silence after the protests cease is therefore not just an absence of noise, but a palpable presence, a victory that can be heard and felt. These implicit cues create a rich, immersive world and underscore the story's central theme: the conflict between the authentic and the artificial. The use of repetition is a key device. Brenda's repeated empty slogans, "the people's land," "hoarded resources," are contrasted with the state's singular, powerful, and legally binding declaration of eminent domain. Her pattern of protest and harassment, documented by the police, becomes a predictable loop that ultimately tightens like a noose around her own neck. The repetition highlights her one-dimensional nature and the predictability of her tactics. Arthur, in contrast, never repeats himself. Each action he takes is a new and unexpected escalation, a move she cannot anticipate. This contrast between her repetitive circular attacks and his linear, escalating response is what defines the conflict. She is stuck in a loop of outrage, while he is moving purposefully toward a final, unrepeatable solution. This makes her downfall feel not just deserved, but inevitable, the logical conclusion of her own obsessive and destructive pattern of behavior. Foreshadowing is woven throughout the early parts of the narrative. Silas's warnings about people from the valley, inventing problems. The early, seemingly boring mention of the state's infrastructure projects during a routine briefing. These small details plant seeds that will bear fruit later in the story. They create a sense of a larger world operating in the background, a world that Arthur will eventually leverage to his advantage. The initial call to the police, where Arthur states his intention to start a paper trail, foreshadows his meticulous evidence-based approach to the entire conflict. He is thinking several moves ahead from the very beginning. This foreshadowing ensures that the final solution, while shocking and dramatic, does not come out of nowhere. It feels earned, the culmination of a carefully laid plan, rather than a convenient plot twist. It rewards the attentive reader and adds to the satisfaction of the conclusion, making them feel like they were in on the plan all along. The final confrontation is a masterstroke of indirectness. Arthur and Brenda never have a final, face-to-face shouting match. He defeats her from 100 miles away, through the proxy of a uniformed marshal and an official document. This clinical, detached victory is far more powerful and humiliating for Brenda than any personal confrontation would have been. It demonstrates the vast difference in the scale of their power. She required a mob and a bullhorn to feel important. He required only his signature. By refusing to engage with her on her level, he invalidates her entire approach to conflict. He treats her not as a worthy adversary, but as a logistical problem to be solved, an obstruction to be removed. The police presence at her eviction serves as the final, silent confirmation of this power dynamic. They are not there to argue with her or to listen to her grievances. They are there to enforce the final, non-negotiable decision of the state, a state that Arthur commands. Her irrelevance is her ultimate punishment. The epilogue provides a detailed and deeply satisfying resolution. It's not enough to see Brenda lose. The audience needs to see Arthur win, and more importantly, to see the community benefit. The success of the Governor Arthur Vance Memorial Highway provides the inspirational element of the story. It proves that his actions, while personally motivated, had a genuine and positive public outcome. This transforms the story from a simple revenge narrative into a more complex tale of justice and effective governance. The final image of the mountain being turned into a public park brings the story full circle. Arthur ultimately gives the people what Brenda claimed she was fighting for, but he does it on his own terms. As a gift, not a concession. It is the final, posthumous victory, a testament to his character and a final repudiation of Brenda's entire philosophy. He proves that true generosity comes from a position of strength and ownership, not from the envious demands of those who have built nothing of their own. The direct address to the audience in the opening and the outro serves to frame the entire narrative as a piece of compelling storytelling. It creates a conversational, YouTube storyteller vibe, pulling the viewer in and making them feel like they're being told a secret, an inside story. The hook, "Ever wonder what happens?" is a classic open loop that promises a satisfying payoff. The call to action at the end, asking where people are watching from, builds a sense of community around the content. This framing device acknowledges the story's nature as a piece of entertainment, a modern-day fable for an audience that craves stories of justice and comeuppance. It allows the narrative to be both a dramatic, first-person account in spirit, though told in third person, and a shared, communal experience. It's a story meant to be told around a digital campfire, and the direct address is the storyteller, looking his audience in the eye. Ultimately, the story is a power fantasy, a David versus Goliath tale for the modern age, where the system itself becomes the slingshot. It taps into a deep-seated frustration with petty tyrants, bureaucratic bullies, and those who use the language of social justice as a weapon for personal gain. Governor Arthur Vance is the ultimate fantasy hero for anyone who has ever been harassed by a Karen. He doesn't just win an argument, he brings the full, crushing weight of the law, the economy, and the government down on his antagonist's head. The involvement of the police is critical, as they transform from frustrated peacekeepers, hamstrung by the law, into the agents of the story's final, karmic justice. The story is meticulously constructed to be a vindication journey, leading the reader from a state of peaceful contentment, through the stress and anger of the conflict, to a climax of triumphant, almost righteous vengeance, and finally, to an uplifting and restorative conclusion. It is a story designed to make the reader stand up and cheer, a perfect execution of a fantasy of absolute, methodical, and unassailable victory.